Hi everyone, my name is Ty. Our group includes Josh, Yishuan, Sarab, women by Veronica, and today we'll talk to you about an explanation-based fine-tuning as a method that can help make large language models become more robust. As you may know, in the realm of machine learning and AI, when you train a model on certain tasks, it can be very susceptible to the problem of spurious correlation. This means that while learning, the model has accidentally picked up features that it perceives to be important in a prediction, while this feature could be a data artifact, might not be important at all to actually predicting a target class. If you know the cautionary tale of the tank urban legend, a few AI researchers from a long time ago perceived that they have trained a super effective tank classifier to predict tank or no tank from an image. It turns out that their classifier has associated all images taken in the daytime as tanks, while all images taken during the nighttime, the model classified them to not be tank. Just to have a few more demonstration here from computer vision, when you try to classify an otter, you don't want the model to associate all otters with wavy waters, or you don't want the model to associate all rhinoceros beetle with the picture of a hand. Similarly, the problem of spurious correlation also exists in language models, and language models can exploit the wrong features to make prediction in a variety of ways. One of which is if the user has induced an explicit attack, or that the model contains societal biases contained within their training data. And lastly, they could pick up spurious cues, usually in the form of linguistic features. The figure that I include here is an example of an explicit attack, where this is an article on Super Bowl 50, and the paragraph talks about John Elway as the actual quarterback that led the Broncos to their Super Bowl 33 victory. And the question asks, what is the name of the quarterback who was in that Super Bowl 33? And while the right answer should be John Elway, the model fails because of a distractor tagged along at the end here, where it mentions Jeff Dean. So how do we try to guard language models against these spurious cues? To briefly go over previous work, previous authors have mostly focused on 2D biasing methods. One is model-based and one is data-based. In model-based, authors have tried things such as manipulating attention layers in BERT, or having a strong learner learn from the mistake that the weak learners make, usually including failures due to learning spurious cues. In data-based approaches, some things authors have done is augmenting the data in a way that completely remove the training examples that are most correlated with spurious cues, and completely remove them from the training process to help make model more robust. Or some other authors have also constructed a pretty challenging evaluation set, where if the model performs poorly, it is easy to deduce that it has picked up on non-important cues while making a prediction. A few very new literature on explanation-based inference has inspired a lot of our research and signal that explanations could perhaps help large language models overcome these sort of spurious biases. One is the chain of thought literature, where authors kind of prompt GPT-3 with a few exemplars that contains a very good chain of reasoning, and show that GPT-3 can sort of mimic these prompts to express its reasoning and arrive at a much better prediction while performing on mathematical and logical reasoning tasks. And sort of similar, Lampinen et al., the authors show that when you prompt GPT-3 to not only generate an answer, but also an explanation for that answer, it also leads it to perform better on a variety of tasks and domains. And their domains are broader than just mathematical and logical reasoning. which is what we have. So then our question becomes, under a fine-tuning context, can explanations make fine-tuned models more robust?
I'm Isha, and I'll introduce the method of our project. To simplify the problem, we conduct experiments on binary classification problems. In the correct dataset, we determine whether a claim is correct, and for ESNLI, whether the premise entails the hypothesis. For COM-BE, whether the first or second sentence makes more sense, and SPIC requires us to output whether a Twitter is offensive. The task types are common sense reasoning, natural language inference, and social bias inference. Next, to generate bias dataset, we use filtering methods to construct bias subset of training data. Given a bias we want to introduce to the data, for example, the longer sentence tend to be correct, we filter the dataset so that certain bias feature only exists in the positively labeled data, and the distribution of the constructed dataset is shown in this table. In the sentence length bias example, this means that in the bias dataset, longer sentences always have a positive label. To be consistent in our experiments, we always use 1,000 training data and 500 test data. Both of them are balanced. The resulting dataset is challenging for language model because the model needs to concentrate on the semantic meaning of the prompt to infer the right answer despite the spurious correlation. We select features that are not expected to be causally related to binary labels. The four common biases here are tested across all datasets. Specifically, we introduce biases such that longer sentences tend to be correct, all sentences in the present tense tend to be right, and plurality bias means that whether the sentence contains plural nouns, like whether it's about multiple objects. Cluster embedding bias is a bit different from the others. To construct this, we use a sentence-BERT model to generate text embedding for each sentence and run the k-means algorithm on the training set to classify the sentences into two clusters. The cluster assignments are generally evenly distributed. The bias will be the sentence in the first cluster are always positively labeled. Additionally, to create realistic bias in each dataset, we select domain-specific biases. For the correct dataset, we filter the data such that sentences with above median perplexity measured by GPT-2 tend to be right, and for SPIC, we bias the dataset so that posts with Twitter handles are offensive. In ESNLI, we consider the gender bias feature, which is whether the premise contains female-related pronouns such as woman or lady. In COM-BE, the two sentences being compared usually only differ by one word, and we consider the post tag of this word and determine that the bias feature is present if the word is a noun. For example, when comparing robots can talk and robots can eat food, we compare the first different word and check its post tag. We want the model to be able to overcome the spurious patterns, and our approach is to debug the model by adding explanations. To evaluate the effect of this approach, we compare the performance of the model from standard fine-tuning and explanation fine-tuning. In standard fine-tuning, we input a question and let the model generate an answer as true or false. In explanation-based fine-tuning, the model generates the answer following an explanation to justify its prediction. We evaluate both the accuracy of the bias models on this test set, as well as the correlation between the model's prediction and the bias feature we introduced. We also fine-tuned models with unbiased training data as baselines. The size of the unbiased training data is also 1,000, and the unbiased baseline models are fine-tuned using both standard and explanation-based fine-tuning. Specifically, we show the difference between our standard fine-tune and explanation-based fine-tuning. Explanations are inserted before the answer for each dataset.
Cool. Thanks, Ishwan. My name's Sarab, and I'll go over the results we got from running these experiments. So here we have our baseline results. These are all using the base Da Vinci model from OpenAI. And we see that the model is unable to solve most of these tasks in the zero-shot setting, but few-shot prompting improves the performance in a good deal in Creek and SBIG. Unsurprisingly, fine-tuning makes a huge difference in every single task. And I guess the last thing to note here is that the explanation-based fine-tuning generally had lower performance than the standard fine-tuning, though the difference is quite small. So moving on to our bias fine-tuning, we have this table. I know it's a little intimidating, so let me break it down. So each cell contains an accuracy score, which is the percentage that you see, as well as a correlation between the model's output and the bias feature that we'd introduced in that row. So first, we see that explanation fine-tuning was significantly more effective in certain tasks than others, or certain data sets than others. Namely, it did wonders in ESNLI, and it did pretty good in Creek as well. We can see a jump as much as 20% in certain biases, which I think is really promising. But in ComV and SBIC, we see a much more lukewarm result. Despite the kinds of lukewarm gains in accuracy, though, we do see that the correlations have dropped in most cases, suggesting that the explanation-based fine-tuning did make the model more robust to the bias feature that we introduced, though it might have hurt the model in some other of the testing examples. And the last thing I want to point out is the different results across the different biases. The cluster bias caused the accuracy to drop an average of 15% for the standard fine-tuning, but only 4% for explanation fine-tuning. In fact, this was the only bias that was successfully and significantly mitigated by the use of explanations across the board. And Josh will talk more about this, but it's also interesting to note that this is the only kind of semantic bias. All these other ones are syntactic, sentence length, the tense, the part of speech, the plurality, and things like that. But the cluster embedding bias has to do with the actual meaning of the prompts. So that's something interesting to note. But yeah, some of the results for some of the other biases are not as strong as the cluster one. Yeah, and that's all for me. I'll pass on to Josh to do a little bit more analysis on these results and what they might imply.
So why do we think that having explanations in the generation help the model overcome these spurious correlations in the dataset? We think that this is because having the model generate explanations acts as a form of regularization. This form of regularization essentially relies on the model having really good priors in terms of what a plausible causal explanation looks like. Because in the entire dataset that GPT-3 was fed on, for example, we hypothesized that whenever it encountered a causal claim, that causal claim was more likely to be plausible than not. In other words, the model will be able to tell if an explanation looks fishy. So, in order for a model to learn a bias, it also has to learn some way of generating a low perplexity, implausible explanation to accompany it. And this explains why our method only works on larger Da Vinci models. Da Vinci is the only model with strong enough priors where we can essentially use them to our advantage. Talking more about why this method works as regularization, we can also see that it has downsides similar to other kinds of regularization. Because we can see that in a lot of the datasets, they benefit a lot from fine-tuning, increasing the accuracy typically by double digits. But once we apply our method, we can see that the in-distribution performance of these models goes down typically by low single digits, similar to other forms of regularization. But the upside can be pretty good. On out-of-distribution evaluation on normal test sets without bias, performance goes up, in some cases, by double digits. With those frameworks in mind, we can also explain some potential differences across the datasets. Because we noticed that compared to Creek and ESNLI, our method performed relatively less well for ComV and SBIC. In the case of Conv, we think that this is because biases generally had a weaker effect on Conv relative to other datasets. Thus, the accuracy penalty that these models incurred from the fine-tuning were essentially overcoming the gains from out-of-distribution performance. In the case of Conv, where we have the strongest bias, the embedding cluster bias, we can see that having explanations did help. And as for the case of SBIC, we think that the reason why our method performed less well is because the explanations in SBIC came in the form of fixed templates instead of free-form text written by annotators. So this essentially means that the SBIC explanations were easier to learn compared to other explanations coming from other datasets. So what are the main limitations in our paper? The biggest limitation is that we are operating in a scenario where the bias feature is 100% correlated with the outcome variable. We can see that in our experiments that our model worked best when the bias was strong. So maybe when the out-of-distribution gains are smaller and the bias is more subtle, the accuracy penalty is less worth it. Another potential limitation is the fact that we fixed our fine-tuning examples to 1,000 examples. But something we'd like to note is that subtle biases are easier to pick up on when the number of examples is larger. So we don't know how well our approach works well for lower or higher values of n. In terms of future work, there's a lot of work we can do in terms of examining our explanations. We note that some explanations might work better than others. That's why our method didn't work as well for SBIC. So what exactly makes an explanation good in this case? That's something we have yet to figure out. And another thing is that labeling explanations is hard. Maybe there can be some way of automatically generating these explanations. Another thing we can examine is what would happen if we operated in a bias-aware setting. Because under our experiments, we operated under the assumption that the biases were unknown. What would happen if we are actually aware of the biases and the examples it presented itself in? Maybe there can be more optimizations done with that information added.